Well, thank you to everybody who's joined us today for this IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management webinar. We're really excited to be able to talk about the new Handbook of Cultural Ecosystem Services, which is a project that several of us within one of the thematic groups of CIM, the Cultural Practices and Ecosystem Management thematic group, have been working on for several years. And so it's really fortuitous to be able to talk to everyone about this project, share what the book is attempting to do, talk a little bit about how we developed the book, and then hear from some of the authors that have contributed such rich papers to make this what we think is a really exciting and hopefully definitive work on cultural ecosystem services. So I'm Pam McElwee. I'm one of the editors of the Handbook on Cultural Ecosystem Services. I'm also a co-lead of the thematic group on cultural practices and ecosystem management for CIM. And so it's my pleasure to be able to introduce some of the other editors who've been part of this process for the last, boy, how long have we been working on it? 2 years. So next slide, please. So in addition to myself, I'll have each of the other editors introduce themselves in the order you can see on the slide. So I'll turn it over to Karen first.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Karen Allen. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and sustainability science at Furman University, which is in South Carolina of the United States. I work primarily in social ecological systems research, studying the impact of economic environmental policy on decision making.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Rachelle.
Yeah, hello everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Rachelle Gould, and I am an associate professor at the University of Vermont. And my research focuses on two main things. The one we're talking about, cultural ecosystem services and relational values and the valuation of nature. And then I also study environmental learning and environmental behavior, and then the links between those two things.
Great. Thank you, Rachelle. Minna, if you're able, I know you've got some kiddos in the background. Yeah, Minna may not be able to jump on right at this moment, but she has been co-lead with me for the past 7 years of the Cultural Practices and Ecosystem Management thematic group of IUCN. She holds a PhD from McCary University and has done work on Indigenous knowledge in relation to disaster management practices and governance. And finally, Jun.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jun He. I come from China. I am a professor at the Yunnan University. My background is human ecology. So most of my research is focused on indigenous people about their knowledge and their rights to use natural resources. And I look at the governance of forestry and also look at the cultural practice, how they use the resources of indigenous people. So nice to be here.
Great. Thank you so much to all the other editors. This has really been a labor of love. We've worked really closely over the past couple of years to make this possible. And I really appreciate everyone's efforts to get us to where we are today, which is we can announce that the book is going to be released next week. So we just got this morning a final email from the press that it has been sent. It is being printed. It will be available on May 29th. So you can get it. We'll share in a minute a QR code so you can see where you get it from. But it will be available in print versions, but also thanks to the generosity of CIM and IUCN and several of the institutions of authors within the handbook, we have made it completely open access. So the ebook version will be available to everyone at no cost. And that will happen as well on May 29th. So we'll share all of the links in a minute. But I wanted to say just a little bit about the webinar. So our plan for the webinar today is we're going to go through explain the genesis of the book and the different sections of the book, provide an introduction to some of the papers through the authors that are with us today. And then our plan is to leave about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers, and we'll open it up to everybody then. So we will plan on doing that around 11:45, and then we will conclude 11:45 Eastern time, and then we'll conclude right on the hour. So if you can hold any questions you have until the Q&A, and then at that point, just raise your hand and so forth. We'll be able to call on everybody. So next slide, please. So a little bit of an introduction to what this handbook is and where it came from. So the original genesis was that some of us in the cultural practices thematic group back in 2019, pre-pandemic, started to put together a special issue of Ecology and Society on cultural ecosystem services, because we thought it was a topic that really spoke to the idea of the importance of understanding and recognizing cultural practices, different knowledge systems, different value systems in relationship to a lot of the work that those of us in the Commission for Ecosystem Management do. And so we were able to publish that special issue. It came out in 2020. We had about 8 papers plus an introduction. So several of the people that are here today, so Karen and Chelsea in particular, Jun and Minna and I were all part of that special issue. Once that came out, we were then contacted by Routledge by an editor who asked, would we be interested in expanding that and doing a full handbook to really provide a comprehensive look at cultural ecosystem services? And it didn't take long for us to realize that this was a great opportunity. So we said yes pretty quickly. We issued a call through IUCN and through other networks for papers. We had really strong interest. We had to select a sort of smaller selection of papers because there was so much interest, and we tried to have a balance across a number of different themes. And so we ended up with 34 chapters. We have 91 authors on the handbook that represent 19 countries. And so we're really proud of that comprehensive author team with strong representation from the Global South, because we thought it was particularly important for this topic. So the book itself is divided into 7 sections. And so we'll talk and walk through each of these sections to give an overview of what the book is trying to do and the flavor of some of the themes in it. But our overall goals were really to provide a sort of one-stop shop to really discuss cutting-edge research, methodologies, application of cultural ecosystem services, and really take us in new potential directions. And so we sort of started at the core of this idea that cultural ecosystem services are really about relations that people have with the environment. And they often are representative of non-material relationships and different values and knowledge systems. And so cultural ecosystem services have been around basically since the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So now, with that title, 20 years, but the idea behind them going back much further. And we felt that it was a timely opportunity to really see where we've come from, how far we've gone, what some new directions might be for CES research. So that's kind of the framing of the handbook and why we did it and why it looks the way that it does. So now I think what we'll do is walk through the different sections and give people the flavor of what some of the papers in the handbook are. So at this point, I will turn it over to Rachelle to talk about section 1.
Wonderful. Thank you, Pam. So we're going to start out with a small section, one of our smallest sections here to warm up. So there are 2 chapters in here. I wrote one of them with my wonderful colleague at the University of British Columbia, Terry Satterfield. The other one is by, as you can see, Jonathan Fisk, Kirsten Liang, Aloki Nakachi, and Rebecca Ingram, who work in Hawaii and do a lot of work with indigenous populations there. And there's a recurring theme in both of these chapters as we start out with this approaching and defining section. So the figure you're seeing is a figure from the second chapter, with chapter 3 that you're seeing, a net to hold our futures. And the idea that this is representing is that cultural ecosystem services are those fibers and cordage that create this net that leads us into the future. That's their metaphor. So I'm going to talk for a moment about their chapter, and then I'll talk about our chapter. So the Fisk chapter just acknowledges the critiques of cultural ecosystem services that we're talking about in our chapter. So we both are sort of starting with that. We know people critique this topic, and they're specifically focused on critiques related to indigenous knowledge. But because ecosystem services frameworks are, as we all know, quite widely used, the Fisk chapter, and this is a quote, they choose to focus on how CES knowledge can be used more generatively rather than whether CES is a sufficient framework. And I chose that quote because that really is kind of a lot of the ethos of the book, I think, as well. And so starting off with these two chapters, we both sort of have that mentality of like, we know that there are issues, but how can we use this more effectively? And so their chapter focuses on what they call interventions, including both formal governance like policy and informal activities like community-based stewardship. So next slide, thank you. So now moving on to this chapter, which I co-wrote with Terry. So here we're really looking the critiques of cultural ecosystem services in the face, not pretending they don't exist, but sort of taking that approach that you can make a stronger argument if you know what your critiques are and figure out how to respond to them. So the structure of this chapter is that we identify 8 critiques that are out there of cultural ecosystem services, and then we systematically, go through and respond to each of those critiques. And obviously, in the few minutes I have today, I'm not going to be able to talk. So I wanted to say, before you saw this, I want to say, wait a minute, don't worry. It's totally overwhelming. What you're going to see is a very overwhelming slide. And if you try to read it all, you'll get a headache. So don't do that. This is a figure that really kind of encapsulates our whole chapter. So we're going to focus just on the bottom couple of lines there. So now let's see this overwhelming image here. So at the bottom here, I want you to look at these. This is a summary of our critiques. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through very briefly the critiques we address, and then the responses I won't have time for. But we divided the critiques into foundational. They're in purple at the bottom. So the foundational critiques, and then more mechanical critiques. And so the foundational, and then the little icons you're seeing, that you have the key over on the left, are a kind of schematic of our response to each of the critiques. So the bottom 3 foundational critiques are that CES are not reciprocal, that they separate humans and nature, and they separate material and non-material. So these are so fundamental that they're at the very basic definitional level of cultural ecosystem services. And our response to that is yes. Absolutely true. That's a problem. But we still think this frame is valuable. We still think, we talk about why is this still a helpful category, even though it has these problems. And then with the mechanical critiques, we discuss how they ignore or exacerbate power inequities and say, yes, but that's true of far beyond cultural services. That's just a generic problem, profound problem. And then encourage commodification and this quantification, monetization are inappropriate. Those are closely related, and saying, yes, that's true, but you don't, basically that operationalization can minimize these. So those are tendencies, but CES don't have to manifest those challenges, that they can be implemented in ways that get around them. And then the not capturing instrumental values, we say not fully true. We talk about the relational piece that Pam mentioned at the beginning, that's really the way that this field is moving towards more relational approaches and understanding these services in a more relational way. And then finally, the last 2 are just that the people have problems with the terms. And our response there is that, yes, no term is perfect. We still think that this concept really encapsulates some important things and makes a space to talk about some of the things that are most important to people in a really important policy making space. So that's our argument, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to turn to you again, Rachelle, because I think you're also introducing section 2. And so as you can see, each of these sections has a series of themes, but I also want to point out, we've got some amazing artwork in this book as well. And so some of the artwork that you're seeing on these slides was specifically developed. So we have a wonderful cover, which is part of the artwork that was developed for a chapter around cultural ecosystem services damages in Brazil. So it's a way to try to capture all of the potential losses of those relational cultural benefits from living with nature. But we also have some very joyous artwork as well. And so you can see an example of it here. But I think it's an added benefit of our handbook because it really draws on the importance of art and humanities in thinking about cultural ecosystem services as well. So I'll turn back to Rachelle again for part 2.
Yes, so I'm just going to introduce this part, and then we are lucky to have one of the authors here to dive into one of the chapters. So this section is really about some of the ways we might think about cultural ecosystem services, some big bins that get a lot of attention within the cultural ecosystem services space. So the first chapter here is psychological ecosystem services. So this is where the cultural ecosystem services space overlaps with the health field and the sort of mental health part of the story. So that chapter focuses on that. I will not say too much about the next chapter because we have Kevin Wood here who's going to talk to you about it for a couple of minutes. So I'll leave that to him. The sixth chapter is, as you can see, about really focusing on recreation and fisheries and how those interact. So recreation, obviously one of the biggest cultural ecosystem services that we discuss that gets most attention if you look at all the reviews. So this one really digs into recreation in the case of fisheries. And then the last is a really interesting one coming from scholars in Brazil, talking about the way that tourism interacts with more place-based cultural services. So this one really gets at some of these equity issues around cultural ecosystem services for who. And when you have, they're talking about when you have populations coming in, there are cultural ecosystem services associated with ecotourism. And then there are also a lot of services associated with the populations that live in a place. And so they really discuss that sort of tension. And with that, I will turn it over to Kevin, who is here with us from the Wetlands Trust in the UK and has created this with a team, a wonderful chapter. Tell us more, Kevin.
Thank you very much. So yes, I'm Kevin Wood. I'm part of the research team at WT, and we're based in the UK, but we work internationally. And we contributed this chapter on the application of cultural ecosystem services in the work of environmental, non-governmental organizations, so non-profits, charities, etc. And it's a topic we've been really interested in over the last few years, because the more we look in our own work and the work of our partners, the more culture is present. We see that it underpins so much of the work that we do, whether that's when we ask people undertaking recreational activities to help us monitor wildlife, whether that's the way we leverage aesthetic beauties and ideals of aesthetic beauty in our communication, so we're using images of charismatic species, for example, or the way in which so many of the people who volunteer at some of our nature reserves, their motivations are underpinned by a really strong sense of place and personal connections to these sites. And it got us to thinking that really we wanted to know more about this topic and how much the NGO community was engaging with the topic of culture and how it was underpinning their work. So we carried out an online survey to try and get more of that information, and in particular to try and identify some of the barriers that might be preventing this and some of the enablers that could help us to overcome it and get more integration of culture into our work. And we received 43 responses from 19 countries. And what we found was that generally people who work for NGOs are familiar with the term. So about 3/4 of the people who responded were familiar with the CES concept, and about 70% of those actively used it in their work. And we found that for all of the different types of cultural ecosystem service that we put to people, overwhelmingly people found that they were at least somewhat helpful in the work that they were doing. And we've collated lots of examples of that in our chapter, so I do encourage you to have a look through those. Now, this complicated figure here is a summation of all the barriers and enablers that people reported to us. So the barriers are inside the three circles here, and the enablers are outside. And we've grouped them thematically into public, policy, and practice issues. And there's far more than I could possibly hope to get through here, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one of the big historical barriers that ENGOs have found to incorporating more aspects of culture in their work is the perception that many decision makers simply don't value things that can't be quantified in terms of economics, and that arguments related to the cultural importance of ecosystems often don't get the traction that we need to really persuade decision makers. But many of our respondents also highlighted as an enabler that recent developments in non-monetary methods of valuation have really helped them to make arguments about the importance of CES more effectively to decision makers, and they are starting to get more traction. So hopefully, taken together, this gives us a much better understanding of how ENGOs such as ourselves are engaging with culture in our conservation work and how we can overcome some of the historical barriers that prevented that. I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. That was wonderful. Great. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Jun, who's going to introduce part 3 and our speaker in part 3, Nicole. So Jun, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Actually, the third part of this kind of theme, we are trying to look at the cultural ecosystem services from a more kind of indigenous people's perspective. That's why we put the same as a place, identity, and cultural ecosystem services. It's because the indigenous people, it's their knowledge and also their sense of place and place attachment, and also their cultural identity is quite closely linked with the cultural ecosystem services. So in this part, we have 4 chapters in this part. And the first 2 chapters actually is very kind of closely linked, mostly look at the sacred landscape. The first chapter is done by myself and also one of my colleagues. We look at the Tibetan people's identity through the sacred landscape, the sacred mountain, the sacred land, and also the holy trees. And those also highly reflect their culture, their local identity as a part of cultural ecosystem services. And the second chapter also similar in India. We found they found the same kind of links between the sacred kind of landscape with the cultural ecosystem services. So first 2 chapters is a very kind of a similar kind of perspective. The third chapter look at the wildlife conservation and the cultural and the community outcome, and how these are linked with the cultural ecosystem services. As everybody understand that the cultural ecosystem services is not only about the meaning of the culture, also the how it's more linked to the recreation activity, and also once these cultural ecosystem services are fully kind of support or understand, it's do contribute to the conservation and the community's outcomes. So that is about the third chapter. So the last chapter, probably I will not talk it more detail, because Nicole will talk that more elaborate with this chapter. Yes, please, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jun. And it's such an honor to be here with all of you today. Thanks so much for having me. So connecting with what Jun has just said, our chapter takes a slightly different angle on this. We do incorporate, though, a local ecological lens, as you'll see. And I also want to start out by thanking my co-author, Allison Bowers, on this. We're so excited for the launch of this book. How fortuitous that you all will be able to see the entire book this week as well. And again, we're grateful for a chance to share our thinking and work on this. We investigated how place connections and collective action interact to create transformative change. So through this book's focus on cultural ecosystem services, we applied a new lens to what we believe is a powerful conceptual model that links place connections and collective action. And you can see that here in our slide. So next slide, please. To explain transformative change, we reference familiar paradigm shifts that we've seen over time, such as the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution, or even today's information age. And these all have involved fundamental shifts in the way that people and societies think and act, leading to significant societal reorganization. And increasingly today, people are calling for intentional paradigm shifts that allow us to achieve a more sustainable world. Such a shift involves rethinking patterns of consumption, transportation, energy use, food systems, and ultimately a deep altering of our values, norms, and systems. So while traditionally we focus on changing individual behaviors in the field where I work, which is similar to Rachelle, looking at environmental learning and environmental behavior, we recognize now that this needed transformative change will only occur through collective action. So again, while we still do focus on individual change, we need much more. So when it comes to motivating and sustaining the needed collective action across scales and communities, we find that a number of leverage points to spur action can occur through looking at elements such as place connections, or the various relationships, attachments, and emotions that people form with specific places, as we've heard about through some of these other chapters. And researchers have demonstrated a link occurs between place connections and environmental actions. And in our lab, we investigate this through many different lenses. We consider elements such as sense of place connection, place attachment, place identity, and we see these as a type of cultural ecosystem service that emerges when people and the nature-rich world interact. The environment provides the structure or the physical space, but it's the meanings and values that we associate with these spaces that transform space into place, or the places that we care about. So in the conceptual model, which you see here represented very simplistically, you can see how these people and nature interactions create a reinforcing loop. We see that ecosystems provide services, many of which represent or relate to place connections, which then motivate collective environmental action. So as people work together to protect and nurture places, the places are improved, leading to stronger place connections, creating this reinforcing flywheel of positive action and place enhancement. And we find that over time, this cycle contributes to positive and sustained change as people become involved and place connections are strengthened. So we conclude the chapter by sharing findings from a case study that we conducted in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where we conducted interviews with people engaged in successful environmental action. And we found evidence of cultural ecosystem services motivating their involvement. You'll hear echoes in this chapter of other chapters that we've just heard presented. So we found that in people's descriptions of how and why they became involved in collective environmental action, they described motivations that included outdoor recreation, cultural heritage, aesthetic beauty, and community identity. And then also, perhaps not surprisingly, we uncovered many tensions that people described, namely around renewable energy, where they talked about the aesthetic of scenic view sheds in their place, sometimes conflicting with sustainability goals. So some interviewees described how people weren't supportive of solar panels, for example, or wind turbines because of the perceived threat to the scenic mountain views that defined their area's identity. So this speaks to the complexity of the relationships between cultural ecosystem services and what we perhaps more typically think of as environmental action, but also suggests an opportunity for rich dialogue. And by understanding and nurturing place connections that form and strengthen through cultural ecosystem services, we can more appropriately reflect deep-seated values that motivate and sustain collective action, ultimately driving the transformative change that we so urgently need. So thank you again, and looking forward to reading the handbook in its entirety.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. I realized I neglected to properly introduce you. So Nicole is an associate professor of environmental behavioral sciences at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability, where she runs a social ecology lab. So it was great hearing about your work, Nicole. Thanks so much. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Karen, who is going to introduce the next two sections for us. Over to you, Karen.
Excellent. So I'm going to introduce part 4, which is titled CES Across Ecologies. This section focuses on similarities and differences across ecologies in terms of how CES and biophysical ecosystem services interact. The chapters in this section span diverse ecological contexts from coastal systems to urban landscapes, and they range from highly managed systems like agroecosystems or rooftop gardens to ecosystems with varied management intensities, such as forests and wetlands. The chapters note where access to and availability of CES are facing challenges, and the section more broadly highlights how human and non-human relationships are co-created across space. So I'm not going to go through every chapter today. We do have Dr. Austin Himes here with us, and he is going to present his chapter on cultural ecosystem services and forests. Dr. Himes is an assistant professor in the School of the Environment at Washington State University in the United States. So Austin?
Thanks, Karen. And thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to talk about this chapter. This was a really interesting project for me. It gave me an opportunity to talk about a system that I'm deeply involved in, forests, often in a different context than cultural ecosystem services, but look at it through this lens. So this chapter really starts off talking about the forests across the globe and their importance for people generally. So if we think about forests, they cover more than a third of the surface of the planet Earth, and more than 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is concentrated in forest ecosystems. So obviously they have a tremendous amount of importance for people, for all sorts of ecosystem services, and consequently also very important for cultural ecosystem services. If we go to the next slide. So this chapter starts off as a light review of the different types of cultural ecosystem services that are found in forests. And we look at different category typologies for cultural ecosystem services like the MEA or the CISIS. Then we can see examples of almost every type of cultural ecosystem services is provided by forests somewhere in the world. And the chapter starts off providing a light overview of some examples of each of those. But these categories are somewhat limited in being able to describe the place-specific importance of cultural ecosystem services. And so sometimes thinking beyond these types of categories is important, which is a case that I make in the chapter as it moves forward. And one of the reasons that considering beyond these categories might be important is because the different ways that people relate to forest often contribute to cultural ecosystem services in complex ways, including being intermediated through material benefits that forests provide, whether that's through timber. And so we can look at communities in coastal Pacific Northwest US where there's historically been logging towns, and that extractive practice is actually important to collective and individual identity. Or we can look at examples of sacred forests or use of things like wood for sacred and ceremonial purposes, like Navajo Nation utilizing different types of tree species harvested in ceremonies and in sweat lodges. And so those cultural benefits of identity or practices of ceremony are tied up in the material benefits that are provided by forests as well, which makes categorizing some of the cultural ecosystem services that come from forests difficult and more complex. So one of the things I encourage in the chapter is considering investigations of cultural ecosystem services by first understanding the different types of relationships that people have with forests around the world. Whether these are relationships that are largely mediated by material benefits that forests provide, and then thinking about how even through what we might think of as primarily provisioning benefits, like in plantation, civical or plantation management of forests in different places, that also cultural ecosystem services can arise from those relationships, as well as they can from more extreme contexts, such as sacred forests, where utilization of material goods is strictly prohibited in order to preserve those cultural importance of those forests. And then the chapter concludes with some considerations about how global change may impact the provisioning of cultural services from forests into the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Austin. I'm going to introduce part 5 now. So part 5 of the book focuses on methods and valuation for cultural ecosystem services. The chapters all center on creative methods that attempt to approximate the value or the importance of cultural ecosystem services for people who use and depend on these services in their lives. The chapters explore topics such as CES ranking, deliberative methods, as you can see in some of the titles here, monetary valuation, which is actually a chapter I led up, and even value articulation through artistic expression and situated practice. The section grapples with some of the difficult questions surrounding CES valuation, such as whether placing a dollar value on cultural ecosystem services ultimately supports or hinders CES protection and preservation. To provide a little bit more of an in-depth look at a particular chapter, I'm going to invite Dr. Chelsea Hunter, an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of North Texas, to present her co-authored chapter on cultural ecosystem services as situated practice.
Hi, everyone. Delighted to be here with you today. And as Karen mentioned, I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Matthew Lauer, who's a professor at San Diego State University. In our chapter, we argue for treating ecosystem services as a situated practice where ecosystem services are able to register a diversity of epistemological and ontological positions, even ones that dominate or challenge dominant knowledge systems. Our chapter stems out of our research in the South Pacific island of Moorea, French Polynesia, which is a hub for marine-based tourism, scientific research on coral reefs, and is home to a vibrant fishing culture that's rooted in Polynesian tradition and identity. Our ecosystem services research there was inspired by science studies, and we aim to critically examine the process of eliciting values and how ontological assumptions about the world are translated in the process of so doing. And we viewed our survey as contributing to our data rather than as neutrally producing it. In our research, we used a photo elicitation exercise that used photos to depict 11 different ecosystem services on the island. The photos were all taken on the island, and they represented primarily cultural services. And then we asked respondents to rank them according to their importance. And then following this exercise, we also asked respondents to evaluate the method according to how they thought they were able to demonstrate their values of the marine environment through the photo elicitation exercise. We conducted this research with individuals from 4 groups. Oh, you can change the slide. Thanks, Karen. We conducted the research with people from 4 groups that included professional fishers, marine scientists, tourism operators, and members of the general population, most of whom fish and recreate in the marine environment. And we found that while most folks agreed that they were able to demonstrate their values through the survey, their commentary and narratives during the survey revealed incongruencies between how the ecosystem services framework describes the world versus how they describe the world. We also found that some respondents, particularly the Tahitian or Polynesian respondents, tended towards ranking the images used in the photo exercise rather than the services they were intended to represent, even when we provided clarification or coaching regarding the photo's intended representation. And so we argue that this shows how the tools we use to measure the value of ecosystem services are not neutral nor transparent, but they shape the findings produced through ecosystem services research. And thus we call for treating ecosystem services research as a situated practice. And a situated practice, it would be one rooted in the local context and one which avoids assumptions about what exists in the world, allowing for multiple epistemologies and ontologies to emerge from the research practice. So the figure shown on the slide demonstrates the difference between a conventional ecosystem services research model that views the researcher as an external observer, identifying values and then projecting those on, and then projecting that into the world, versus treating research as a situated practice where all are entangled in producing values through the research process. So in summary, cultural ecosystem services and their sister concept of relational values are a welcome shift in recognizing the entanglements between and reliance among people and ecosystems. But treating ecosystem services research as a situated practice suggests that conventional ecosystem services research, including those that include cultural services, presupposes a particular epistemological and ontological position that posits division between ecosystem services and values. And by treating ecosystem services research instead as a situated practice that's contingent upon local context, you're able to foreground underlying assumptions and make them available for scrutiny, and then therefore open up more analytical space for a reflexive, plural, and relational understandings of the human and non-human coexistence. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Chelsea. So I have the pleasure of introducing the next section, which is thinking about the ways in which cultural ecosystem services get incorporated or not into decision-making, management, and policy. So the question really animating this section was the fact that in the past, in particular, policies to manage those landscapes that are providing CES often did not formally recognize them, or sometimes might have treated the CES as outcomes of management for other priorities, other ecosystem services. And a lot of the policies, particularly these early policies, tended to focus on those instrumental benefits, so things that you could actually quantify, things like tourism, CES. But there's been a lot of advances in this area. And so the papers in this section really, I think, push the envelope in thinking about how CES is being incorporated into management and decision-making and policies in different, creative, non-instrumental, really inclusive ways. And so we have a paper by Martinez Harms and her co-authors looking at cultural ecosystem services within well-being assessment, so tying it to human well-being. We have a paper looking at the ways in which CES are being incorporated into future scenarios. So doing sort of projections about what the plausible futures might look like in the future and using some case studies from Japan. That's the paper by Lahoti et al. We have a really interesting paper by Fraga et al. Looking at the ways in which cultural ecosystem services are being understood or not in cases of damage assessments. And so their paper looks at the impacts of a dam collapse in Brazil and the ways that the authors who work for an NGO in Brazil argued to make sure that cultural benefits from ecosystems that were destroyed by that dam tailing collapse were being included in compensation discussions for the indigenous communities that were affected. We also have a paper which is really creative in looking at cultural ecosystem services within payments for ecosystem services policies. and the challenges that that faces, one that looks at CES in the context of carbon credits and carbon markets, and finally, a paper that really is thinking about innovative ways to include CES in decision-making by incorporating Indigenous worldviews and knowledge, and has a really interesting case study of dam removal in the Pacific Northwest of the US, and that's halting it out. So I also had a paper in this section where I and my co-authors looked specifically at the countries of Southeast Asia, where we have a huge set of rich and diverse ecosystems, rich and diverse human cultures, but often policies that don't recognize those intersections. And so what we did in our paper was to interview decision makers in 4 key countries, so Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Indonesia, and ask decision makers, how do you think about CES? Where are you incorporating those into formal policies and where are you not? So next slide, please. So one of the things that we discovered is that there are essentially a small number of formal policies in Southeast Asia that do mention CES, that do have tangible ways of trying to incorporate that into decision making. And then there's some indirect policies. And so these are kind of represented by the 2 photos. So the one of people in a landscape getting on a bridge is a national park in Vietnam, where a payment for ecosystem services policy includes as one of its potential things that it's paying for cultural landscape and tourism values. And so it formally recognizes CES as something that can be paid for by that payments for ecosystem services policy. The problem is that it's been very hard to operationalize. So of the 30 provinces in Vietnam that do these payments, only 4 of them have operationalized tourism payments, and it's only amounted to about 1% of the total payments for ecosystem services revenue stream. And so part of the reason is that it's been very challenging to try to come up with a way to recognize the both monetary and non-monetary values and then build that into some sort of payment mechanism. We also looked at formal policies in places like Singapore that has something called the Active, Beautiful, Clean Waters, the ABC program, which incorporates cultural ecosystem services into the management of urban water spaces. So a very nature-based solutions approach within Singapore. So those were examples that showed us that there are some direct policies that are including CES, although they do face challenges. We also looked at policies that are indirectly referencing CES. So they might be managing for something else, but there is a recognition that there are cultural benefits from that management. And so that's represented by the photo on the right, which is a temple in Indonesia where many cultural benefits related to religious practices are obtained through water management. And so important policies around water management that try to address the fact that people do receive cultural benefits from these water policies. We also looked at policies having to do with cultural heritage, and then policies having to do with environmental impact assessments. And so these are increasingly starting to filter up into some of these formal policies, but the chapter really talks about what the challenges that they face. So a lot of policymakers still don't understand CES. They face challenges around multiple stakeholders and trying to argue for their active participation in defining what CES are and how they could be incorporated in decision making. So we end with a lot of opportunities to move forward for both researchers and policymakers to work together to identify key aspects for improvement. So the next section is our concluding section. And for this, I'm going to turn it back to Karen.
Excellent. Thank you, Pam. So this is part 7. It's our concluding section of the book. And there's only 3 chapters in this section, one of which is the actual conclusion. And what the chapters in this section cumulatively do is they explore new directions for CES. The chapters attempt to ingest some of the critiques of CES that have been articulated in recent years and offer a pathway forward for CES scholarship and practice. For example, Rosen's chapter on Indigenous knowledges examines the ways in which CES is embedded in Western science and as a result can tend to perpetuate power structures that undermine local knowledge systems. Chan and others propose a merging of sorts between CES scholarship and the more recently popularized concept of relational values by asking the question, What if CES were relational? They then propose a framework for how this approach to CES might be operationalized. And finally, Rachelle and I conclude with some final remarks on CES and the pathway forward. So in our concluding reflection, we identify what we see as three of the most important next steps for CES. In orange, you see re-envisioning CES as relational. In green, developing a coherent pathway or a way to discuss CES and why they matter. And then over in purple, our third point, which is the integration of CES with other frameworks for environmental decision-making. Many of the book's chapters address CES in a highly relational way. In other words, they emphasize how CES are created and articulated through relationships between humans and non-humans, often deriving their meaning in a particular time and space. Such chapters address how all phases of the life cycle of the CES can be relational, from how research characterizes CES to how valuation brings CES into conversation with decision-making, to even questioning the very definition of CES itself. Hence, we propose that CES representation needs to be better understood as a bidirectional relationship between humans and the environment, and one that is often place-based and therefore not substitutable. This means that CES research cannot be readily abstracted from place, nor can effective policy. The second point we make here is that policymakers often appear open to consideration of CES and decision-making, as was actually mentioned in one of the chapters today, but the breadth of CES definitions and concepts can make it difficult to translate core understandings to policy action. We therefore advocate here for a more unified approach to CES in terms of definition and approach as outlined in the book. And this relates to our third point about improving the connection between CES assessment and decision-making through policy. One central frontier for CES is, we suggest, to co-evolve CES research and integration into decision-making so that they work together toward transformative change. So first, scholars should continue creative development of CES valuation to better align with dominant decision-making approaches, which is shown here in our Route A. We can then work to modify those dominant decision-making approaches to better accommodate diverse forms of knowledge, as we show here in our Route B, so that policy and research might work in tandem as an iterative process that incorporates many framings and methods that embrace plural values, which are widely discussed in this handbook. We envision that CES research and practice might establish a middle ground between the highly generalized technocratic approaches to CES conservation and the entirely context-dependent grassroots case studies that may not be translatable across scales. We believe that this book provides rich examples of the variety of approaches that expose the transformational capacity of CES research and practice, and we hope that you will find it useful in your work. So on that note, thank you for your time here. And I believe, Pam, we have time for some questions.
We do, yeah. Let's open it up to questions. So folks in the audience, please indicate with your hand button if you have questions. And I see we also have some of our authors who weren't formal panelists are also here as participants. So they should feel free to chime in as well in helping us answer some of these questions. Yes, Joaquin, please. Go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in here. And good to see you.
Yeah. So maybe you can see me now.
Yes.
Good to see you again,
Yeah.
and congratulations to the book. It's really fascinating. Also that you are addressing a lot of diverse cultures in the shaping of the ecosystem services. In some projects, we found that people have been creating a landscape which they considered a cultural heritage, very important. And it was a bit of an obstacle to convince them that in the times of climate change, maybe there was a need for change. So it was even a kind of a lock-in between the cultural service and the way they were doing their work. But my main question was, you are working with a diversity of different cultures. but you are also an author team with a diversity of different cultures. Have you observed whether the different authors in your team have a different take on what makes a cultural ecosystem service or not? Because that would be highly interesting. Thank you.
Great, that's a great question. I kind of heard two questions there. One was on the sort of role of climate change, and maybe Austin, you mentioned part of your chapter is thinking about how climate change is putting pressure on thinking about CES. So you might be able to address that. But I'll take the broader one and maybe ask Rachelle and Karen and Jun to help me with this. And we had a lot of discussions early on about, do we want to present a sort of single definition of CES? Do we want to sort of let 1,000 flowers bloom? And so we sort of did a bit of both, where in the introduction, we do provide a very simple definition of CES that comes from a lot of the work that Rachelle and Kai Chan and so forth have done. But we also told our authors, like run in directions that you want to run in. And so I wouldn't say that there were conflicts over the definition so much as open interpretations. And so, Rachelle, I don't know if you want to jump in here, but you were speaking about some of the early chapters have some pretty strong critiques of the term as part of that, right? We have to be honest that there are some challenges with using this term and not everybody loves it. And we should be open to that. So I'll let maybe Rachelle and then Karen jump in and see if you want to say anything. And then maybe Austin, you want to address the climate issue.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I totally agree with everything Pam said, that I think we saw this more, that there's a core essence, I think, of CES that's almost, it's a little difficult to articulate, but there's a core understanding of these, that there's something about it being the non-material components of these relationships that are material. Like Austin talked about this a little bit, like that there's this, it's focusing on these non-material pieces that are really hard to represent in a lot of the mechanisms that we currently have. They're hard to represent, but extremely important. And so I think that sort of combination is the core sort of, non-material aspects, hard to represent, some of the most important things that we might talk about. And so though people, kind of focused on different aspects of this, I actually think overall there was remarkable sort of coherence, I think in that core idea. But as Karen and I said in the conclusion, I think getting a little more organized ourselves as a community that studies this around how we're talking about it is only going to make the argument stronger. So I think while I think the core essence is the same, I think there's some benefit in at least using some of the same language. Other questions? I don't know if, Karen.
Yeah, Karen.
Well, no, I was just gonna, I was invited to chime in, but I feel like you really covered it, Rachelle. And I didn't know if Austin felt free to respond to the climate change piece of the question.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk in context to my chapter a little bit. And first of all, I don't think we've met Joaquin, but I am a heavy citer of your provisioning of ecosystem services is determined by human agency article. And so it's a pleasure to meet you virtually, at least. I think that there are a lot of impacts, potentially huge impacts of global change, including climate change, on cultural ecosystem services. But at least in the context of forest, it seems to be tremendously understudied. For example, I cite a study by Tom and Siddell from 2016 that does a global review, and basically they find, or it's a survey, excuse me, and they find that cultural services are the thing that people were least concerned about or least interested in studying the impacts of climate change on, but it was also the types of services that people were most worried about losing or were most at risk from climate change. And other things like particularly for Indigenous people where or other cultural services that are maybe tied to specific species or aspects of forest ecosystems may be under threat from invasive species. The emerald ash borer is a great example of this, which is devastating black ash, which is a central sort of component of identity of some tribal groups in North America. And the other thing that I think gets understudied, at least in the context of forests for cultural ecosystem services and global change, is this trend towards urbanization, which is going to make cultural services from urban forests and in urban settings, much more important. And I think those get understudied relative to cultural services and, quote unquote, more natural systems. And so those are some areas where I think global change could have real impact on cultural services and is terribly understudied at the moment.
Great, excellent points. I mean, we hope that this handbook and certainly the points that we just made launch us in new directions. Like several of the chapters identify gaps, where we need to put some effort together, where we might, get our community to come together around some common language or sort out some terminology. Hopefully the handbook will help provide some of that direction and spark conversations to create this sort of continuation of the existing CES community. So other questions? We've got another minute or two if anyone else has questions. So we've got also, if people didn't notice in the chat, we've got a couple of links. So one is to the book itself, the Routledge landing page. So you'll be able to get access to the book. Someone's dropped a link of a paper by Jonathan Fisk, who's one of our authors. They have a new paper out, looks really exciting, urge people to look at that. And then finally, we have a link to where the recording of this webinar will be cited once we get it uploaded. And so you can share it with your colleagues who weren't able to make our webinar today and let them know about it.
Pam, there is a question in the chat. I see. I'll read it. It says, with climate change with climate migration increasing, how should we think about the shifting nature of cultural ecosystem services across time and space?
Great, another excellent question. Yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to jump in and potentially take that. We didn't have a chapter specifically on that, but I think the topic is touched on by several in terms of the fact that cultural ecosystem services are so important for many communities to enable their adaptation, whether it's to, as I mentioned, we have a chapter that looks at damage from a catastrophe. And so cultural ecosystem services were damaged by that event. And they are the very things that would have helped that community adapt to the disaster itself. And so I think we can take some of those lessons in thinking about as communities have to move away from the places where they have these important place attachment dynamic systems. What does it mean to have to be in a new place where you have to reestablish or re-understand or create new senses of place attachment? And I think this is another really understudied area that's potentially going to be really important. I don't know if other folks want to chime in on this, but yeah, thanks for identifying it.
I'll jump in and make a comment on this. I mean, this is something we've looked at in a couple of different case studies. We mentioned just, one case study in here, which is our work in the Shenandoah Valley, but we've also had several of the other case studies looking at this kind of what we call kind of this recursive flywheel of action that occurs when people become engaged in their places and engaged in their communities, which builds and deepens a place connection. And we referred to this as not connection to place or sense of place, but senses of places and connection to places, because it really is a toolkit that people carry with them. And it's particularly important when we think about migration, whether by choice or not by choice. And so something that I think will become increasingly important as we see more climate migration over time. So this is an incredibly important question. I appreciate you asking this, and something I think we can encourage and see supported as people help to create and recreate the places where they live.
Excellent, great points all. Well, we are unfortunately out of time. I have a feeling we could continue discussing these important issues, but we'll have to wrap it up. I did want to say some thank yous at the end. Thank you again to my fellow editors. It's really been a pleasure working with you, and it's great to see the book finally come to fruition. Thank you to all the authors, those that joined us today as formal panelists, those that joined us as participants, and our wider community of authors. It's been really great getting to know them and all of their work. And I hope now that the book is out, we'll be able to maybe take forward some of these new questions that we just heard about at the webinar and maybe do some additional exploration of them. I will say we have a couple of additional events that we're hoping to do after this webinar. So we have asked to have a session at the World Conservation Congress specifically focused on thinking about methods so that other people can learn from the handbook and how they might apply some of this thinking about CES in different contexts. So once we get an answer if we're going to be able to do that or not, we'll share that with the wider community. So keep your eye out for that. And we also will have a poster if anybody's going to the Ecosystem Services Partnership in Darwin, Australia next month. I will be there, several of our authors will be there, and so we'll be sharing a little bit more about the handbook there. If there's other requests for us to talk about the handbook and other forum, we'd be open and welcome to it, so please let us know. And I'd like to say a final thanks to Angela Andrade, who is the chair of SIM and has been a real champion of this work from our very inception, back 8 years when we were just sort of dreaming up ideas, and then to get the special issue and this handbook with the support of Angela and SIM has been really fundamental. And so thanks so much for that. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. And we hope to continue this conversation in different forums moving forward.
See you in Darwin.
Yes, see you in Darwin. Terrific.
See you. Thank you.
Thank you.